how big it is, okay? It's smaller than a centimeter. So if we could look at it here, the nucleus by itself is about 8 micrometers across, okay? So the whole basal cell is only slightly bigger than the nucleus of the mature cell, okay? That's very small. They have a central round oval nucleus. Central meaning that the nucleus is right in the center with the cytoplasm surrounding it, okay? Finely granular chromatin. What do I mean by finely granular chromatin? Can picture powdered sugar, very fine grain, right? Almost like powder. And then the regular kind of sugar is a little bit more granular. And then the raw sugar, the cane sugar, usually is a little bit more chunky in the grain, okay? And then you have rock sugar, okay? So the grain, different size, the finely granular chromatin, meaning that the chromatin is very fine, okay, very smooth. Nuclear cytoplasmic ratio is highest. Nuclear cytoplasmic ratio is the area surface of the nucleus within the cytoplasm. How much space does the nucleus occupy, okay? When the NC ratio is high, meaning that the nucleus is big or take up more space than the cytoplasm, okay? On the other hand, if I say NC ratio is low, that means there are more cytoplasm and very little nucleus, okay? Scan cyanophilic blue-green cytoplasm, so there's not much cytoplasm, appear as a sheet, a flat sheet with polarity, meaning that they all go one direction on a small group. So let's look at the characteristic here. Here is a large group of cells. Now keep in mind, squamous cells are multi-layered, right? So it's not very commonly that we just see one single layer. Even if the cells are together, they may be multiple layers, one on top of the other when you do the sampling. Now the polarity is extremely important in the peribasal and basal cells because normal cells have a very good arrangement in an orderly fashion, whereas abnormal cells, cancer cells, do not. Okay, so that's why we usually have to keep close attention to the polarity. Can you kind of tell that the cells are all going this way, in the same direction? Okay, so this is a group of cells that have good polarity. And if you can look at it, the nucleus, the nucleus of each one of the cells within the group look very similar to each other. That's what we term uniform, okay? Cancer cells, on the other hand, do not look like that. Okay? So normal cells usually have a very uniform nucleus. So this is a nucleus of intermediate squamous cells, and if you look at the size of the nucleus, they are about the same. Okay? They are about the same size. However, in terms of cytoplasm, do they have much cytoplasm compared to these mature cells? Not much. They do have cytoplasm, it's just that all this kind of little greenish, bluish material, that's the cytoplasm. When the cells become fully mature, they do not have a very distinct cytoplasmic border, meaning that the cytoplasm is kind of all merged into each other. You do not really see a distinct border like that to say, this is one cell, this is two cells. Here, you sort of can only count the nucleus, but you do not see the cell border among each other, okay? So this group of cells has a very uniform, the nuclear contour is very smooth, round to oval shape. The chromatin inside the nucleus look very finely granular, homogeneous looking, and a small chromocenter. Okay. So these are the basal cells. Now peribasal cells, a few level up, okay, right on top of the basal cells. Again, are usually seen in atrophic smears of postmenopausal lady and also in postpartum women. The reason that you see the peribasal cells in postpartum women is after deliver the baby, the body is still under the influence of progesterone. Okay, it hasn't fully recovered with the estrogen level yet, so the cells haven't fully matured, a lot of them. They are slightly bigger. They have a range of the size between 12 to approximately 30 micrometers. Okay. Again, they usually have a central nucleus, round to oval shape, very delicate chromatin, dense bluish cytoplasm. Cell borders are more distinct with the parabasal cells. The cells started to mature, so you could see that here's cell number 1, here's cell number 2. And they also appear a single cell on a small sheath group. Keep in mind, the cells, parabasal cells, may be difficult to distinguish from the squamous metaplastic cells. Okay? Sometimes they look so different together. They look not much difference from each other, so it's very difficult to distinguish. Okay, here's a group of parabasal cells. Again, here there are a few single cells that you can see. They have a very nice cell border, right? Central located nucleus with a smooth nuclear contour, fine chromatin, and a small nucleus. Okay, so these are the parabasal cells. Again, the cell here are bigger. This one is probably approaching an intermediate cell size. Okay, so this one is still the parabasal. Here's a single cell. There are a few of the neutrophils in the background. Okay, here is a big sheet. Now keep in mind the cells are multi-layered, right? So for us to look at the picture here, we could see some of the cell in focus, some of the cells are out of focus. However, if you're looking at the microscope, you could focus up and down. You could see through the different layers, okay? The advantages of doing that is because we use this kind of stain that's called the pap stain. Remember Dr. Papanicolaou? Okay, we talk about that in our history of cytology. He invented this particular kind of stain that we call pap stain to use to stain the cells, that you could have this kind of a transparent look. Okay, so that's why when it's multiple layer, you could see through the cells with different layers. Okay, Papanicolaou stain has a very good advantage is you could actually see the nuclear detail very clear. Okay, which the H&E stain do not. H&E stain is the one in the histology. This is the H&E stain that's used in histology. It's monochromatic, meaning that they only have pinkish, purplish color. Okay, there's no differentiation between much of the cytoplasm and the nucleus. Everything is kind of pinkish. But in pap stain, you can see that later on, there are blue, there are pink, there are orange. Okay, and they're green. So you see more of the color, the monochromatic. Here is a sheet of parabasal cells, but in multiple layers. Okay, the center one is kind of blurry because you couldn't see. But if you look at the one at the edges, again, they all have very round, small nucleus. Okay, sitting right in the center. The cells among each other, they respect their space. They're not really crowded together. They're not really pushing into each other. Okay, they just kind of pile on top of each other. That's all. Okay, here is another high power view that you can see the cells. Each one is sitting in their own space. You can start to see a little bit more of the defined area among the cells compared to the basal cell, which is kind of all merged together, right? The cell border is the boundary. But here, you started to see a little bit more of the cell boundary among the cells. Each one of the nucleus still look very uniform and similar to each other, okay? They're not much that bigger. Some may be slightly smaller, but no more than 2 times usually, okay? Like this one here, it's very similar to this one, very similar to this one. It may be a little bit smaller, but the chromatin is the same. Very uniform, even distribution. Okay, so those are the characteristics in the benign normal cells. All right, regardless of what kind of a cells they are, they still have this kind of general characteristic. So later on in your quiz, if I ask you to describe morphology of a squamous cells, parabasal type, you would need to be able to tell me all of this, okay? Okay, so we're moving up. The cells are getting more mature. we're moving up into the intermediate cells layer. Okay, this is the most commonly seen cell type in the normal smear of women in reproductive age, starting from maybe early teens, I would say 15, 16, all the way to right before postmenopausal. Okay, so you see that the cells are getting much bigger, 35 to 40 micron in diameter. Okay, the small spread out. It's the flattened polygonal shape. Usually, it's kind of a round, a little polygonal, and it has a central round to oval shape vesicular nuclei. Keep in mind, the nuclear area measure about 8 to 10 micron meter, about the size of an RBC, red cells. What is the size of this similar to compared to the previous one that we looked at?
Basal cells.
Basal cells, very good. The whole basal cell is about 8 to 12 micrometer, right? So it's like the size of a nucleus. The intermediate cell nucleus is very useful when you're looking at the smears, because we do not have a ruler on a microscope when you look at it. So when you look at the cells, it's hard to say how big it is when you describe it to someone. Okay, but if you say this nucleus is about 5 times of an intermediate cell nucleus, immediately in my mental image, I already have a picture of, oh, okay, this is a big nucleus, 5 times of the intermediate size. Okay. They also have finely granular chromatin in these intermediate cells, but you can see a lot more of the light blue-green color or the pink-orange cytoplasm. Okay. Okay. As the cells becoming more mature and mature, they have well-developed cell border. So the cells spread out more. They become more single, independent, so to speak, okay, when they being sampled. So here I could really see the count, the cell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Whereas in the lower level, parabasal and basal cell is kind of difficult to do that. Okay, so it has a central nucleus, small and round. Okay. Okay, superficial cell. Now we are moving on to the most top couple layers. Again, it's very commonly seen in normal smear of reproductive age. It's the most mature squamous cells. Similar to the intermediate cells, they are flattened polygonal shape, slightly bigger, 45 to 50 or maybe 16 micrometer. However, the major difference between the superficial cells and the intermediate cells, besides the size, is the nucleus. Okay, this nucleus is pycnotic. Pycnotic meaning they kind of like a little dry raisin. All right, they do not have the open chromatin like this one here. Okay, so here you still see the open chromatin, but in superficial cell, the nucleus become a very small, dark, hyperchromatic nucleus. Very small and round, okay, like a little dry raisin. Here are the one with the intermediate cells. Can you see the difference? Okay, and it's about half of the size, or 1/3 of the size of the nucleus of the intermediate cell. At this point, the superficial cells no longer have any kind of replicating function. Okay, so the cells keep growing, mature at the top layer. Eventually, this nucleus will disintegrate and the cells just exfoliate, flick off, okay, and cell dies. And then the new layer is going to replace, okay. Do they have a high NC ratio or low NC ratio?
Low.
Low, okay, very good. Okay, here is another picture of superficial squamous cells. In the squamous cells, sometimes they have the tendency to form what we call the squamous pearl. Oops. Like the cells kind of roll up in a little ball, okay, that we call squamous pearl. So you can see that kind of the nucleus in this round rolling, the sheet is kind of rolled up together like that. It's very commonly seen in keratinized cells too. Okay, squamocolumnar junction. Do I have a picture? Yes, okay. Now again, let's look at the picture. This is the outer cervix with the squamous area, squamous epithelium. Okay, multiple layer. And as we go inside, here is the squamous columnar junction. Further down, then it gets into glandular cells. Okay, so right now we are at the junction here. Squamous columnar junction, also known as the transformation zone, T zone, because they call it transformation zone is because one cell type is changing into another. Okay, so the cells here in the endocervical gland is one single layer. As you could probably guess, if the cells is one single layer, it's very easily affected by either virus, infection, or any kind of abnormal things going on in the environment. Okay, whereas the cells that have multiple layers offer much more protection. Okay, so at this junction right here, the columnar cells with the one single layer is changing into the squamoid looking cells in multiple layers. Okay, so that's why they call it the transformation zone or the junction. That's where the cells are. The cells then, and the word metaplasia meaning changing. Okay, so keep in mind, from columnar cells changing to squamous cells in this area. It presents in the mature and the immature form, also is multi-layer. Now, this is the area that is very prone to infection or dysplastic changing, meaning the cells going through dysplasia, okay, abnormal changes. So a lot of the cancerous or abnormal changes arise in the T zone. Okay, so that's why it's extremely important to look at the cells from the T zones. Here's the picture again. Okay, the T-zone location slightly change over time. In teens, it's pretty much out in the outer cervix here. Okay, so this is going into the cervical canal. This is the outer cervix. So in early teens, the T-zone is like right out here. Between 20 age to 50 is shifted up a little bit. And as it goes menopausal, it's shifted higher. Okay, so it's keep going up higher. The zone kind of shift. Okay, T-zone cells. Here you can see that these are the glandular cells in a honeycomb fashion. Okay, here you see a glandular cells in a column shape. Now compared to the location of the nucleus in squamous cells that are central, the location of a columnar cell, glandular cell is also at the basal, okay, at the bottom. It's usually at the bottom. So this is the bottom, this is the part, the top, okay. They have the terminal bar right here. So the cells all line up like this with the nucleus at the bottom, okay, the basal location. Now, and when they are sideways, what we call the cells, the nucleus are eccentric, meaning that they're off to the center, okay, off the center, eccentric. So columnar cells on the sideway, you can see that they have eccentric nucleus, whereas squamous cells, they have more of their central location, okay. Now because the squamous metaplasia, they are right at the T-zone, they have both characteristics of a columnar glandular cells and the squamous cells, okay. So what you see is they sort of started to become a little bit more flattened, isn't it? Some of them are still kind of off to one side, but they started to have a little bit more cytoplasm. Okay, the granularity of the cytoplasm look very similar to the glandular cells. Okay, they also have very nice round nucleus, smooth nuclear contour, and fine nuclear chromatin. Okay, so remember, T-zone cells have both characteristics of columnar cells and squamous cells. Okay, now what do we mean by immature squamous metaplasia? And again, the cells becoming multiple layers, the immature one at the bottom, and then they started to flatten and into mature at the top. Okay, the cells shape round to oval with well-defined border. Sometimes not well-defined. Sometimes it's a little bit more jaggy and fuzzy at the edges. Okay, they have central round nucleus, fine chromatin, Important, this is important. Okay, the NC ratio is higher. Okay, it's not as high as the basal cell where you see majority of the nucleus with a little bit of cytoplasm. Here, let's look at the cell, this one. Again, you started to see nucleus here, but the cytoplasm maybe occupied half or 2/3 of the space. Okay. In order to determine the cells whether it's normal or not normal, you look at the nucleus. That's the well-being of the cells in the state. Okay. If the cells look normal, healthy, they should have a very well-rounded nucleus, very uniform. If the cell is not healthy, then they may have different shape. Now, to determine what specific type of the cells are, then we look at the cytoplasm. Okay, the texture of the cytoplasm is very important. We talked about earlier where the squamous cells cytoplasm are more dense, okay, surrounded by a nucleus in the center, whereas the glandular cells and metaplasia, the texture of the cytoplasm could be changing. Okay, it could be foamy, it could be a little bit granular, or it could be a little bit dense. Okay, it has both characteristics. So this one, the texture look kind of grainy, right? We call it granular cytoplasm. They still have a very nice round nucleus. Here's a PMN to show you the size. So maybe they are about 1.5 times, no more than 2 times of neutrophils. Okay, those are the size reference. Again, with a central located nucleus, you see there's some cytoplasm surrounding the cells. Okay, since they are immature form, they do not have a as distinct cytoplasm as the mature form, which you will see later. Okay, so this is the mature squamous metaplasia. Again, it looks very similar to parabasal cells. Now the question may come up, how do we distinguish the two? Okay. The important thing is you look at the nucleus. If the nucleus look benign, it doesn't really matter whether it's basal cell, parabasal cell, or is that the mature squamous metaplasia or immature squamous metaplasia. Okay. As long as they're normal. If they're not normal, that's the problem that we have to distinguish. Okay. So again, the mature squamous metaplastic cells have a very round to oval cell border. Let's look at the picture here. More distinct cell border. Round nucleus in the center. Okay. Fine chromatin, smooth nuclear contour, a few of the neutrophils nearby. Okay. If you look at the picture and you're not telling me this is squamous metaplasia, I might be calling it parabasal cells. Okay. However, keep in mind, parabasal cells, we see it in more of the atrophic smear, postmenopausal lady. Whereas metaplasia, we see it along together with mature squamous cells. Okay. Okay. Any questions so far on the squamous cells part? No? Okay. So now let's move into glandular cells. You can ask question anytime. Okay. So let's move into the glandular cells. These are the columnar shape. Endocervical cells. Sometimes we just use the short term, we call EC. Okay. The cells are tall, columnar shape in various lengths. Okay. They doesn't have to be the same length. Sometimes they may be shorter, sometimes they may be taller. Okay. They have a round to oval nuclei located at the basal area at the bottom. Okay. The cells, again, nuclei have a very smooth contour, size similar, vary from 10 to 20 micron in diameter. So sometimes depending on what day of the cycle, the cells may change a little bit depending on the size. Okay. They also have finely, evenly distributed chromatin, occasionally 1 or 2 small nucleolus. The cytoplasm could be vacuolated with the tiny little bubbles, or granular with little granules, texture, more texturized. Okay. You may see cilia on the luminal surface of the cells, on the top of the cells. You may see a little bit of the cilia. Okay. Now they would appear arranged in single cell, small group, sheet or honeycomb pattern. or picket fence arrangement. So here, this is a biopsy that you're looking at. See how the cells are all lining up at the surface? This is the submucosal connective tissue. Look at the location of the nucleus. They're all lining up at the bottom, okay? The top of the cytoplasm, the top portion of cytoplasm here, has the secreting function of secreting mucin, okay, using as protection and lubricant in the body. Okay, so here is a high power on the Pap stain. There are some superficial cells with a small pyknotic-looking nucleus, intermediate cells here, okay, intermediate cells, squamous cells. Here's another superficial cells with a small pyknotic nucleus. And then you see this tall columnar shape with the tiny little nucleus at the bottom, okay? See, they kind of line up in a picket fence, side-by-side arrangement. And then they also in a flat sheet of what we call the honeycomb pattern. So you're like looking at a big sheet like this, okay? However, keep in mind, the cells arrangement sometimes would be distorted mechanically because when you're doing the sampling from the cervix, you're going like this to brush it, okay? So when the cells deposit onto the slide, they may have some distorted architecture. But the general nucleus and the general arrangement should still be there in a very nice fashion. And if you look at the honeycomb, they each have a very similar look to each other. The nucleus is about the same size, same shape. With respect to each other, the cell border very distinct. Okay. Okay, endometrial cells. These are the cells higher in the endometrium. Okay, so now we have passed the cervix, the outer cervix, where you see squamous cells, the T-zone. So let's go back and look at this one here. Okay. We probably don't have it. Anyway, so we're moving on from the outer cervix, whereas into the T-zone, into the endocervical gland. Okay. As I go higher upper into the uterine endometrium. Now, normally, during a sampling process, you would not expect to see endometrium being sampled, okay, because it's really high up in the endocervical canal. However, the endometrial cells naturally exfoliate from the body every month during the menstrual period, okay? Remember the menstrual period? The endometrium kind of exfoliates up with the blood and then get out of the body. Okay, so those are the time that you would expect to see endometrial cells naturally exfoliated from the body is during the early menstrual period, first 5 days usually, from day 1 to day 5. Okay, now anytime after that, we don't expect to see endometrial cells present in the pap smear. Okay. If anytime during after the period that there's endometrial cells present in the pap smear, it may indicate there's some sort of a disease process going on. Okay, and those need to be looked at very carefully. So that's why sometimes on the report we will say endometrial cells present out of cycle, because we know that the patient's last menstrual period is day 5 days ago. Okay, so that's normal to see, but if it's like 15 days ago during ovulation, you would not expect to see endometrial cells. If there are endometrial cells present, it could be disease process. Okay. There's one exception though, that we would expect to see endometrial cells present in the normal pap smear, is what we call the lower uterine segments. Okay, sometimes they sample the patient too aggressively, or maybe the patient anatomically has a very short endocervical canal, or maybe the patient already have a procedure done, that they would sample some of the cells from a lower uterine area. That's what we see. Okay? But normally, endometrial cells exfoliated during menstrual cycle, and after that, we don't usually see that during the rest of the cycle. Okay. The major difference between endometrial cells and endocervical cells are, one is a tall columnar shape, and endometrial cells is a short cuboidal. Okay, they come out in a round ball usually, in a cluster. They are not the lay flat one. Okay, the squamous cells lay flat, multiple layer. Endocervical cells flat, one single layer. But endometrial cells, because they don't have cytoplasm much, they have very little cytoplasm, the cells, when they land on the slice, they becoming a round ball, a tight cluster. Okay, so they're very small. They're only slightly, the whole cells is about the size of the nucleus of intermediate nucleus. Okay, with very little cytoplasm, and chromatin patterns sometimes appear hyperchromatic. Hyperchromatics meaning, what does that mean? I think we heard about that.
It's like it's high chromatin density.
Yeah, it's very dark. Okay, appear more dark. Okay, it has scant cytoplasm, very little cytoplasm. Sometimes you can see bubbles in the cytoplasm. Okay. So if you look at this cluster here, there are several cells nearby. This is the superficial cell. Here's another superficial cell. Here's another superficial cell. And this is a pycnotic nucleus. If you look at the size of the nucleus, they may be 2 times of the pycnotic nucleus. Okay. If there's an intermediate cell nearby, let's see, we don't have an intermediate cell nearby. I have it on the slides later. That you would expect to see the whole cell here is about the size of the intermediate cell nucleus. And it has a tiny bit of cytoplasm. See all this little fuzzy kind of greenish stuff, bluish stuff? Those are the cytoplasm. Okay. Compared to columnar endocervical cells, endometrial cells look more compact together. Okay. And they also look like more disorganized in a way. They're just kind of like a tight little cluster, stick together. It does not have the honeycomb pattern. It does not have the picket fence aligning. So it just kind of jumble up together a cluster. So a lot of time we call this tight aggregates. You see it in 3D balls, a rift and an exodus. I'll give you examples later. The cells are very small compared to the to the endocervical cells, about the size of PMN. The major difference is they do not have much cytoplasm. Okay, so instead of straightforward flat, they are 3-dimensional, tight cluster. Instead of a lot of cytoplasm, they have very little cytoplasm. Okay, so those are the 2 major differences that you would see and help you to recognize the cells. Okay, stromal cells. Stromal cells are usually the cells that are supportive tissues of the endometrium. However, sometimes they have very, excuse me, they have a lot of variation, okay? They're not as easily recognized. So let's look at the picture before we go into the more detail. Let's look at this picture here. Here we have a superficial squamous cells. Okay, we have some neutrophils in the background, and then we have probably parabasal or metaplasia cells. Okay, very nice central location, round polygonal shape, a little well distinct border. Central nucleus, smooth nuclear border. So this is probably parabasal or metaplasia at this point. Okay, more likely metaplasia because we see this superficial cell right there. So this is probably a benign metaplasia here. Now what about all this cell that kind of all scattered throughout? Okay, the cells here, if you look at the texture of the cytoplasm, how would you describe the texture of the cytoplasm? What term would you use? Are they bubbly, vacuolated? Are they kind of granular? Are they dense? Or how would you describe the texture of the cytoplasm?
They look more dense than
More dense? Well, this one kind of look dense. What about this?
grainy.
Grainy? Okay, kind of grainy and more bubbly. Okay, if you look at it closer, I don't know if you maybe you can see it from yours, but if you look at it closer, there's actually a lot of tiny bubbles in the cytoplasm. Okay, so all this, and also if you look at the nucleus of the cells, they look a lot more in variation, right? Variation in size a little, but shape. A lot of variation in shape. They are oval shaped, they are kind of a bean shape, they're off to one side, and here I think they're pointing to a mitosis right here too. Okay, so all these stromal cells, they are the supportive tissue, okay, underneath the endometrium. So when the cells exfoliated into the pap smear during the menstrual period, you can also see the cells in here too. However, the inflammatory cells in the body, in the immune system, and the histiocytes look very similar to that too, okay? But usually you see that with a lot more inflammatory cells together. Okay. The stromal cells may be single or loose aggregate, okay? They very resemble histiocyte. The cytoplasm is foamy, kind of vacuolated, ill-defined border, okay? But all these are very benign looking, uniform looking, okay? They do not have a very malignant looking cells. Okay, so take a look at this picture. Okay, here's the endometrial cells wall. This is what we call exodus. Okay, I don't know who made up this term, but what they mean by there are deep stromal cells in the center. Okay, and then there are epithelial cells kind of outside. All right, in a kind of a wreath. Sometimes they call this a wreath too. Okay, so can you appreciate the kind of a roundness of the cell ball compared to the squamous cell that's kind of all flattened in the background, single? Okay, so one look at this, you know, oh, these are endometrial cells. And if you look at the cells, here is a nucleus of intermediate cell nucleus. If you look at the cells in the center,